Farmgirl expected the worst from these bullies. What they actually want will blow your mind. A story by Heartfelt Tales. The morning sun cast long shadows across Millbrook High's football field as Emma Carter found herself in the most embarrassing situation of her 17 years. Rope wound around her waist, binding her to the ancient oak tree that had stood sentinel over countless homecoming games and graduation ceremonies. Her flannel shirt was askew, her curly brown hair disheveled, and her face burned with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "This is ridiculous," she shouted, struggling against the knots. "Let me go right now." 20 feet away, four members of the Millbrook Bears varsity team stood in their iconic green and gold Letterman jackets, looking equally uncomfortable. The leader, Jake Morrison, ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, his usual confident demeanor cracking under the weight of what they'd just done. "Look, Emma," Jake called out, his voice wavering. "We can explain." "Explain?" Emma's voice rose an octave. "You kidnapped me. You literally tied me to a tree. What possible explanation could justify this insanity?" The truth was, it had all started with a catastrophic misunderstanding 3 weeks earlier. Emma had been walking past the locker rooms after her photography club meeting when she'd overheard Jake talking to his teammates. Through the partially open door, she'd caught fragments of their conversation. "That farm girl. Thinks she's so much better. Needs to be taught a lesson. Friday after school." Her blood had run cold. As the only student who lived on her family's small farm outside town, she was used to being called the farm girl. She'd assumed they were talking about her, planning some cruel prank to humiliate her in front of the entire school. Emma had spent sleepless nights imagining the worst, her anxiety building with each passing day. What Emma hadn't heard was the full context. Jake and his friends had actually been discussing their concern for her. They'd noticed how isolated she seemed, how she always ate lunch alone, and how some of the more popular kids made snide comments about her second-hand clothes and her after-school job at her family's produce stand. "That farm girl Emma seems really lonely," Jake had been saying. "She thinks she's so much better off alone, but everyone needs friends. She needs to be taught that lesson about accepting help. We should do something Friday after school to show her we care." The miscommunication had festered for weeks, creating a gulf of mistrust between Emma and the very people who wanted to help her. On this particular Friday morning, Emma had decided to confront the situation head-on. She'd arrived at school early, planning to catch Jake before first period and tell him exactly what she thought of him and his friends. But fate had other plans. As she'd walked across the field, taking her usual shortcut, she'd spotted something that made her heart race with fear. Tire tracks in the soft earth, leading to the old oak tree. Fresh rope lying in the grass. It looked exactly like the setup for the humiliation she'd been dreading. Panicked and convinced her worst fears were about to come true, Emma had done something completely irrational. She'd grabbed the rope and tied herself to the tree, determined to beat them to the punch and somehow take control of the situation. In her teenage logic, she'd reasoned that if she was already captured when they arrived, she could confront them and expose their plan before they could spring it on her publicly. But as Jake and his teammates had rounded the corner and found her there, the misunderstanding had deepened exponentially. "Oh no," Jake had whispered to his friends. "Someone got to her first. This is exactly what we were worried about." The boys had genuinely believed that Bullies had tied Emma to the tree as a prank, and they'd been trying to figure out how to help her without making the situation worse. Their hesitation to immediately untie her had been born from concern about whether they should call the police first, not from any malicious intent. Now, 20 minutes into this absurd standoff, both sides were locked in a battle born of pure miscommunication. "Emma, please," Jake said, stepping closer despite her glare. "We're trying to help you." "Who did this to you?" "You did," she shouted back. "Stop pretending like you don't know. We found you here." Marcus, Jake's best friend, chimed in. "We were just walking to practice and saw you tied up." We were about to call Principal Hayes an liar. Emma's voice cracked with emotion. I heard you 3 weeks ago. That farm girl needs to be taught a lesson. Ring any bells? The 4 boys exchanged bewildered glances. Slowly, understanding began to dawn on Jake's face. Wait, he said softly. You think we... Emma, you think we tied you up? I know you did. But even as she said it, doubt began creeping into Emma's voice. The genuine confusion on their faces was hard to fake. Jake walked closer, his hands raised peacefully. Emma, I swear on my grandmother's grave, we didn't do this. We found you here. But... He paused, his mind racing. 3 weeks ago, were you listening outside the locker room? Emma's silence was answer enough. Oh my God, Jake breathed. Emma, you didn't hear the whole conversation, did you? For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Emma felt a flutter of uncertainty. What do you mean? Marcus stepped forward. We were talking about you, but not. Emma, we were worried about you. We've been trying to figure out how to be your friend without making you uncomfortable. That's impossible, Emma said, but her voice had lost its earlier conviction. You're popular. You're athletes. People like you don't want to be friends with people like me. People like you? Jake's voice was gentle now. You mean smart, funny, and incredibly talented? Emma, your photography is amazing. Your pictures in the school paper are the only reason half of us even read it. Tommy, the quiet one of the group, spoke up. My mom buys vegetables from your family's stand every week. She says you're the hardest working, most polite kid she's ever met. And you helped my little sister with her math homework last month when she was crying in the library, added Sam, the team's gentle giant. You didn't even know her name, but you spent 2 hours helping her understand fractions. Emma felt tears prick her eyes. But I heard you say I needed to be taught a lesson. Jake's face softened with understanding. The lesson about accepting help. About letting people care about you. Emma, you do everything alone. We wanted to show you that you don't have to. The rope suddenly felt less like a restraint and more like a symbol of all the barriers Emma had built around herself. You really weren't planning to humiliate me? Never, all 4 boys said in unison, and the sincerity in their voices was unmistakable. Then why haven't you untied me? Emma asked, a small smile finally breaking through her defensive facade. Jake grinned sheepishly. Because we thought whoever did this might come back, and we didn't want to mess up evidence for the police. Also, Marcus added with a growing smile, we were kind of afraid you might run away if we untied you before we could explain. Emma laughed despite herself. That's actually not wrong. As Jake worked at the knots, his fingers gentle and careful, Emma felt something shift inside her chest. I tied myself up, she admitted quietly. What? Jake paused in his work. I found the rope and tire tracks this morning, and I panicked. I thought you were setting up some elaborate prank, so I tied myself up first. I thought if I was already here when you arrived, I could confront you and somehow maintain some dignity. She laughed, but it was tinged with embarrassment. It seemed logical at the time. The boys exchanged glances before bursting into laughter, not cruel laughter, but the warm, inclusive kind that made Emma feel like she was in on the joke rather than the target of it. That, Jake said, finally loosening the rope, is the most wonderfully overthought plan I've ever heard. It's very you, Marcus added. Brilliant but completely unnecessary. As the rope fell away, Emma rubbed her wrists and looked at the 4 faces surrounding her. For the first time in years, she didn't see potential enemies or people who were simply tolerating her presence. She saw genuine concern, warmth, and something she'd almost forgotten how to recognize, friendship. I owe you all an apology, she said quietly. I've spent so long assuming the worst about people that I couldn't see when someone was actually trying to be kind. No apology needed, Jake said, extending his hand to help her up. But maybe next time you're worried about something, you could try talking to us instead of staging your own kidnapping? Emma accepted his hand and stood, brushing dirt from her jeans. That's probably more mature, yes. So, Tommy said, grinning, now that we've established that we're not monsters and you're not in actual danger, want to grab lunch with us? The cafeteria is serving those pizza squares that somehow taste better than they have any right to. Emma looked at the four faces turned toward her expectantly. A month ago, she would have made an excuse and fled. But standing there in the shadow of the oak tree that had witnessed her greatest misunderstanding, she felt something new, the courage to let people in. I'd like that, she said, and meant it. As they walked across the field together, Emma realized that sometimes the walls we build to protect ourselves become prisons instead. The rope that had bound her to the tree had been nothing compared to the barriers she'd constructed around her heart. But just like those physical knots, emotional ones could be untied too. Sometimes all it took was the right people and the willingness to let them try. Jake fell into step beside her as they approached the school building. You know, he said thoughtfully, we never did figure out where that rope came from. Emma grinned. Groundskeeper shed. I may have borrowed it. You broke into the groundskeeper's shed to steal rope for your fake kidnapping? When you put it like that, it sounds even worse. Marcus jogged up on her other side. Emma Carter, you are going to fit in with us perfectly. And as they pushed through the doors of Millbrook High together, Emma finally understood what she'd been missing all these years. It wasn't that she wasn't worth befriending, it was that she'd never given anyone the chance to try. The oak tree stood silent behind them, its ancient branches having witnessed another small miracle, the moment when misunderstanding transformed into connection, when assumption gave way to truth, and when one lonely girl learned that sometimes the scariest thing you can do is trust someone enough to let them untie the knots you've bound yourself with. In the weeks that followed, Emma would join the boys for lunch every day. She would photograph their games and help Marcus with his English essays. She would learn that Jake volunteered at the animal shelter on weekends and that Tommy was secretly writing a novel. She would discover that Sam, despite his intimidating size, was afraid of spiders and loved romantic comedies. But most importantly, she would learn that the best friendships often begin with misunderstandings, because it's in the process of clearing up our misconceptions about each other that we discover who people really are underneath. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, we find that the person we thought was our enemy was actually just a friend waiting for the chance to prove it.